The Science Show on RN. David Mark just then gave another mention to the links between art and science, and by implication the humanities. And so what does the new president of their academy, Professor Leslie Head, think of that association? Congratulations on being voted president.
Thank you.
And the first thing I'd like to do is to read you part of an editorial in a recent edition of the journal Nature. It says, from the beginning, exhilarating, challenging, enlightening, stimulating, inspiring, fun. These are some of the words that Nature readers use to describe their experiences of art-science collaborations in a series of articles on partnerships between artists and researchers. Nearly 40% of the roughly 350 people who responded to an accompanying poll said they had collaborated with artists, and almost all said they would consider doing so in the future. Now, without being distracted by definitions of what's arts, what's humanities and what's sciences, Leslie Head, do those words surprise you?
Not really, no. I think there's lots of exciting collaborations that are possible between the sciences and the humanities, and that article also makes the point that the artists didn't want to just be seen as the public relations arm of the sciences. They wanted to be in the room at the beginning when the questions are asked and when the projects are developed. So I think there are lots of avenues for exciting collaboration.
Is this what the Academy, your Academy, is doing in future and has done in the past?
Well, the 5 learned academies do work quite closely together through ACOLA, the Australian Council of Learned Academies. We've worked on a number of projects together, notably last year with the rapid response process developed by the then Chief Scientist, Alan Finkel, responding to COVID, among other things. And there are lots of possibilities for continuing that kind of collaborative work in the future.
One more illustration from that editorial, which I think is quite illustrative of what you have just said. They say, one example of how artists and scientists have together rocked the senses came last month when the Sydney Symphony Orchestra in Australia performed a reworked version of Antonio Vivaldi's The Four Seasons. They reimagined the 300-year-old score by injecting the latest climate prediction data for each season, provided by Monash University's Climate Change Communication Research Hub in Melbourne. The work was entitled The Uncertain Four Seasons, and variations of the score containing local data were sent to every major orchestra in the world. The performance was a creative call to action ahead of November's United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, United Kingdom. Impressed?
It sounds amazing, actually. It's a good illustration that many of the things we have to reimagine in a climate-changing world are some of the ways we conceptualise things, including the seasons. And we know from the past that different cultures conceptualise and understand seasons differently, and often those interpretations are also illuminating climate change science. So there are lots of different possibilities, I think, in reworking our concepts for climate change.
As a geographer, is this your line of research anyway?
So I've worked through my career at the kind of intersection between geography and archaeology, and most of my recent work is in the cultural end of geography, so looking at the cultural dimensions of environmental issues, including climate change, but not only climate change.
And how are you doing that?
A lot of it is interviewing different communities and different types of communities. In particular in Australia, I think we've underestimated the potential of the multicultural community to really show different understandings of environment and different practices. We've had a long debate in Australian public life about the settler culture versus the Indigenous cultures, and that's important and still continuing. But in the process of that debate, we've ignored the many non-Anglo migrant contributions to Australian life and Australian environmental understanding. So a lot of our projects at the moment are working with those kinds of communities. It really broadens the range of cultural resources we can bring to bear on these issues, and illustrates or provides alternative ways of doing things. So we need lots of different ideas at the table for these kind of social transformations we're going to need. And the more the merrier in some ways, yeah.
Isn't there a problem with scientists being quite strict about the definitions and how you define the data and how you compare one thing with the other? Once you get across the boundaries, you can get metaphors and you can get different aspects of definitions of time, for example. I remember when we were once talking to someone about an archaeological site, actually in Victoria, and the Indigenous people were asked for their reaction. They said, well, we've always been here. There wasn't a question of how many thousands of years. It's just been always. So marrying the different definitions, isn't that slightly awkward sometimes?
It can be awkward, but it can also be a very creative process. And I think your archaeological example is a good one there, because archaeological scientists have worked for several decades now with Indigenous communities, and there's been differences and disagreements, but there's also a much richer story about Australia's past than we had before.
How important is it for the public to understand these alliances? Because we've had STEM being discussed, science, technology, maths and engineering and so on. And some people call it STEAM, STEAM where you add A for arts. And there are, I think you also have your own definition or acronyms in the humanities as well, do you not?
So we're testing out a new acronym that was developed by the British Academy: Social Sciences, Humanities and the Arts for People and the Economies / Environment. So that's quite a mouthful, but the acronym we have used in the past, HASS, Humanities and Social Sciences, doesn't really resonate outside Australia. So sometimes it's a limitation to communication. And we think SHAPE has the potential because it sounds pretty dynamic. But of course, these things take a long time to resonate culturally, and apparently it took STEM and STEAM a decade or so to become part of people's thinking and language. So we'll see what happens there. But to the substance of your question, it is really important for the public to see a range of different types of areas where scientists and humanities scholars are collaborating, and every museum in the country would be one example.
It certainly would. So there we have the journal Nature and other journals, in fact, at the top level, applauding what you say in terms of alliances. The Academy is doing this. And yet, at the same time, we have a kind of message to the public and a message to the scholars of a different rate of charge for doing certain degrees. You know, it's much cheaper to do a science degree than now it is to do an arts degree. How does that impact on the public attitude?
Well, I think we don't actually know yet. We're going to need a few years of data to see how the student enrolments are affected by these changes. The Academy of Humanities argued against those changes for a number of reasons, including that the evidence shows that there are just as many humanities jobs available as STEM jobs. And remember that both STEM and SHAPE areas claim critical and creative thinking as the core of their skill set. And we should remember that every student who goes to university in Australia is developing those key skills and in flexible ways that are going to help them to contribute to society in the future. So it would be a very counterproductive outcome to set this up as a science versus humanities fight or argument when the whole university sector is under pressure, and we really need to strengthen our intellectual life across the board.
Thank you very much indeed, and congratulations again.
Thanks, Robin.
Professor Leslie Head is at the University of Melbourne and is the new president of the Academy of the Humanities. And as a geographer who mentioned climate just now, she prompts us to go east once more, out in the Pacific, to join Pauline Newman yet again.